Thank you, Christina. Thank you, everybody. Dear colleagues, dear friends and fans of IENE, I'm very privileged and honored to welcome Gaya Herrington to the 9th International IENE Conference on Transportation, Infrastructure and Ecology. We have been doing these conferences now for a couple of years, and it's always fascinating to see so many new faces and old faces. It's a growing community that is fantastic to work with. I hope that the virus of biodiversity, of road ecology, as our former president has called us, will spread to all of you and infect you with the inspiration that we have. Now we have Gaya with us. So, welcome, Gaya. Do you hear us?
Yes.
Great.
Thank you.
Great.
Glad to be here.
Let me introduce you to Gaya, or Gaya to you. Gaya is a pioneer and expert in sustainability, and she's very much acknowledged for her transformative research and the advocacy for embracing the limits to growth and putting ecological and human concerns into the heart of our economy. Gaya is currently the Vice President for Sustainability Research at the Schneider Electric. And she's a member of the Club of Rome, which we will hear more about. She has been an advisor to the Dutch government and to the Dutch central bank, so she has quite some resume behind her. Gaya obtained her first master's degree in Amsterdam in econometrics. Then she moved to the United States only to get her second master's in sustainability. Gaya is well known for her reanalysis of The Limits to Growth, the book written by the Club of Rome 52 years ago, and her subsequent book on the insights for avoiding the global collapse, something that is so relevant now, and everybody here in this room should read, because I think this is exactly what we need to know, to embrace, to transform the world. But Gaya, before I give you the screen, now you have it already, I give you the floor. Allow me to say some words to explain the significance of your presentation, your keynote for IENE. And for that I have to step back a bit. I think many of us think that we are standing at a critical crossroads. As we already have heard, we must choose the path to follow. And it's not in 100 years, it's now. The time is short. This may be a decisive moment for IENE, for the transport sector, and for life itself. So you might ask, why should we worry? I mean, look at all the wealth that we have accumulated, all the progress we have made. It has been a wonderful time behind us, but if we turn around, you see that the future is in a completely different light. The outlook is indeed very grim. It is no wonder that the young people feel angry, frustrated, disengaged. What they see ahead and what they have been taught and brought to them in movies, in video games, in research papers, in other media, is a very dystopian future, an hothouse Earth where large regions are inhabitable, where famine and despair, ethnical and cultural conflicts dominate. They see that the natural capital on which they have to survive has already been squandered by their parents, by us. And we have started the 6th mass extinction this planet has to endure. It's not made by a celestial body falling on Earth or something like that. It's by our own making, our own greed. to use Greta's words, you know, the little girl, how dare we? I can only say, how dare we to live on a loan that we're not intending to pay back and only use to create even greater depth for each other and for future generations. But on the other hand, there is some light in this darkness, and even among the older generations, there is awareness rising, growing. There's a recognition that we must change our course, and there's also the sensation that a different path is possible. As Elke said, we have to develop a vision. We have to know where we are heading, and I think this is growing quickly now. And a lot of that has already been initiated. Researchers have identified critical thresholds, so they have told us that there are limits to what we can do. There are thresholds that we must not surpass. Experts, including ourselves, have been developing tools and methods. Universities have embraced and advocated sustainability. Governments have formulated goals for nations and businesses. But still, the progress we see is slow, is probably way too slow. And as we heard, the transformative change that we need still lies ahead of us. In our small community in infrastructure and ecology, just sitting at the fringe between transport and ecology, we have for over 30 years now worked to decouple transportation from its harmful impacts on nature. We have designed wonderful mitigation measures, built ecoducts, and developed handbooks. We have been providing advice, and we can build infrastructure in a much different way. We advocate for nature-based solutions, and we hope that the new technologies, and AI may help us to increase their efficiency, provide safety and comfort for us. But at the same time, we are beginning to realize that all our efforts and the benefits they bring are likely to be annihilated by the growing need for transportation, our growing thirst for more consumption, for more traffic, for more trade, for more infrastructure and more roads. I think to truly alter our course, we need to address and understand the root causes of this dilemma. We need to address the underlying forces that are still pushing us forward. And this is exactly where Gaya's presentation will help us to broaden our perspective and guide us in the necessary steps that I believe are necessary to reach a meaningful change. So let her talk be the first in a series of seminars, workshops, projects that IENE will entertain to change the outlook of the transport sector. Let this be an inspiration for IENE to develop the IENE conference declaration and take bolder words in promoting a different path and a different path and presenting our ideas for how we can work and how we can promote to protect biodiversity in the headlight of the future transportation. So thank you for your patience, and thank you, Gaya, for being here. Please take it from here.
Glad to be here. Thank you. That was a wonderful introduction. I'll quickly share my screen. And thanks again for that great introduction. So I don't have to talk about myself anymore, and we can just dive into the content, which I always prefer. Hello, good afternoon to you all. I'm reaching you here from Washington, D.C., but I was born in Europe, and I still have my EU passport, just as a backup, you know. So let's talk about what as Andreas just said, what my research, what I think it means for a way forward, and then also particularly what it means for transportation. So the Limits to Growth study that Andreas mentioned was commissioned by the Club of Rome, of which I'm now a member. At the time, there were different people gathering in Rome, and they asked one another the question, why is it that despite all our knowledge and innovation, we keep having these persistent problems, poverty, pollution, conflict, disease? And they said, presumably these things are interrelated, but how? And they asked a group of MIT scientists to find the answer to that. And in order to find that answer, the MIT scientists created the first system dynamics model of the world. And with it, they created several scenarios. You see 4 scenarios here. So it's always a little bit overwhelming at first, but system dynamics was at the time a new modeling technique to model complex systems such as our society or economy or indeed our ecosystem. So as Andreas mentioned, my first master's was in econometrics, so I'm very, very familiar with these more mainstream models. But what you typically see there is that most variables are not connected to one another, and they are exogenous, as it is called. And in system dynamics, all variables can interact, and no variables are exogenous. They're all in the same system. And it is in that way, but I think much better to model certain kind of complex situations, such as when human beings are involved. Because then you can model things like exponential growth, exponential decay, long delays before you actually see the accumulated impacts from certain things. So they use that for all of these variables that you see here on the screen are global variables. So it was a very complex system. There were hundreds of variables. These are a few that I think are important. Industrial output, production, food, population, pollution, and resources. In this case, that was natural resources, so including fossil fuels. Now, they started with the 2 business as usual runs. So that's the top 2 ones, the BAU and BAU2. The only difference between those 2 is that in the BAU2, they assume double the amount of fossil fuels. It doesn't really matter, because what they found that when they assumed nothing on top of historical averages and behavior, they saw somewhere in the 21st century, in the first half of it, a steep decline, which they dubbed collapse. It doesn't mean the end of humankind, but it does mean a steep decline from a previous peak nonetheless. So not pleasant. And what they found is that more resources doesn't help. It delays the collapse, but it also allows business as usual to continue for longer, which makes the peak steeper. So that's what you see here. Then what I did was I took these 2 and 2 others that I thought were interesting, including the one on the right, on the lower right, the stabilized world, SW, and I compared empirical data with that, because this was published in 1972. So I thought, that could be interesting to see how we've actually fared with that. We don't have time to go into all the scenarios. Of course, they are in that original book, which was a bestseller, The Limits to Growth. But it is noteworthy that in all their scenarios, some ended in collapse, like the business as usual. Some did not, including the stabilized world. As you can see there at the bottom right, there's a peak, and then it stabilizes, and that's why it was called a stabilized world. You can also call it a sustainable world. But what happens there is that this one did have additional assumptions to historical behavior. What they specifically assumed in that scenario is that at a certain point, humanity lets go of this growth pursuit of ever more industrial output. And the resources that are freed up through that are redirected deliberately to what they called human services, which is mostly education and health, and to protecting nature. So with that, the welfare levels were maintained. There were no scenarios where industrial output growth was able to continue indefinitely. So what I did, as I mentioned, is I took empirical data and compared that. It was first published in Yale's Journal of Industrial Ecology, so that's a peer-reviewed article. And when that went viral, I was asked to write a book, which you can purchase a copy of, but you can also download it for free. That was important to me. So that also contains an update with a few more data points from a few years, but the conclusion was the same. We are, and you see a little bit on the right there, because editors really like the word collapse. So the way that my research was framed when it went viral was pretty dramatic, as we're heading towards doom. It's a little bit more subtle and nuanced than that. So let me give you my interpretation of what I think I found. So this is a good impression of the overall fit that I found. So I took data from public sources, just World Bank, UN, that sort of thing, ecological footprint network, and I plotted that. So the dashed purple line there is empirical data, and then there are the 4 different scenarios. This is a good impression of what I overall found. So overall close fit with all of the scenarios, which is pretty impressive for a model. I know quite a few models. Most are not this accurate decades into the future. Why they were all still closely aligned is because they haven't diverged much yet. But as you can see, in the next few decades, they will do so significantly. And that was the other finding. It was possible to distinguish already, and we are most closely aligned to a business as usual scenario, which shows collapse setting in around about a decade from now. But we're not that far away from what I would call as more desired, the stabilized world scenario. And so what I concluded of this is, yes, we are not on track for a sustainable world. We are heading in the wrong direction for sure, but we're not that far away yet from the stabilized world scenario where we can't put new data points on a different trajectory. And this is the chart that I use to illustrate that with, because it's arguably the one we're most interested in, human welfare or well-being. As you can see, there's a close alignment there. And you can see that we're really at a peak. And so what I concluded is we have a now or never moment in history where what we do in the next 5 years, we're really talking about single-digit years, it will determine our well-being for the rest of this century. There are moments in time in history where not that much happens. This is not such a decade. This is a unique moment in history. And we have a now or never moment to deliberately change course. We are not heading in that direction, so it will have to be deliberate. And we're running out of time for that, because once we are on the decline, it will be impossible to readjust towards that stabilized world scenario. So what would that mean, this redirection? Well, we would have to do what is assumed in that scenario, right? Which is letting go of the growth pursuit and redirecting resources towards a new goal, which would be, you could say, meeting human needs within planetary boundaries, or as I call it, human and ecological well-being. So a well-being economy. The thing is that, Andreas mentioned this already, you actually don't need this model to tell us this imperative, like the urgency and the imperative. That's by now really well documented by much better researchers than me. And I think that was interesting. When my research went viral, people, I did a lot of interviews, and people were like, "Oh, so we're heading towards an ecosystem breakdown." I was like, "Yeah, you didn't know that? It's because we've been warned. We've been, for example, above Earth's carrying capacity since the 70s. This is all publicly available. It's just one Google away." Andreas mentioned Johan Rockström's planetary boundaries. We've crossed 6 of them by now. This is the safe operating space of the world. Like, if that breaks down, that's the end of life as we know it. We don't see decoupling in the data. So this bar chart here is of the best performing countries in the world, because at a global level, there's zero evidence of even carbon decoupling, let alone any other decoupling. Like in biodiversity, that's still accelerating. There has been some decoupling in a handful of countries, but that's the red bars there. And if you compare that to what is necessary to stay within the Paris Agreement, it's orders of magnitude away. A lot of people don't know this. Even the share in the energy mix of fossil fuels has hardly come down. So we're at an all-time use. The absolute amount is an all-time high of fossil fuels. Carbon footprint, ecological footprint are all at all-time highs. But even just the percentage-wise, it has never been below 80%. So it's just not happening. So we know that we have to change. We know the imperative. This is, I think, very obvious, actually. But then, so we have to do it. And then, can we? And I think, yes, that's also possible. We absolutely have the technologies, which will be crucially important once it's directed towards the right goal. So far, renewables have been added to the fossil fuel use. They haven't replaced it. When you change the goal, that will become different. But it's more than technology. We also need policies. We need the right indicators, and we have all those too. Everybody agrees that GDP is not a good measure of well-being. Even the guy who came up with it, Kuznets, warned that it was not a good measure of well-being, and for some reason the world just went with it. But we have alternatives that seem perfectly fine. They could not grow on forever either, by the way. So we also need a different economic system. And I think that's what I would call the well-being economy paradigm. But we have that too. We have several post-growth economics. People here are probably familiar with Kate Raworth's donut economics. There's full circle economics. That's people here are probably familiar with circularity, but full circle economics talks about, well, you can't just have circularity in materials if you don't also have circularity in money and power. All of that needs to flow. So it adds to that pivotal social dimension. Regenerative economics, which was, we have ecological economics, which is a little bit older. There's degrowth, which is really becoming mainstream, especially in Europe right now, which is more of a pathway towards these destination frameworks. But I think it's important for me, and what Andreas talked about as well, is yes, the possibility, but also the opportunity in it. When I ask people to draw what they think the current economy is, it's an upward line, right? That's what we're taught ever more, and it's always going to be better, or at least it's going to be more, and we kind of assume it's better, and that's not the case, but all right, still, it's a line. And if you ask people, well, what is your ideal economy? They draw something different. And it always typically is something of like something round, something where things come back. The donut of Kate Raworth is an excellent example of that. But you see this in general. It goes towards really an intuition that we already have, that really it should be, yes, it can be finite. A circle is finite, but it's also whole. There's a certain kind of harmony in it. And for me, that's also the possibility and the opportunity in this. Even if we didn't have the imperative, even if we weren't facing ecosystem breakdown, we would still want to make this transition because it would be a nicer place to live, where we're not told that we're just maximizing consumers, but we're actually people will have a whole plethora of things, and we get a lot of meaning, and we derive purpose from contributing to our world and making it a little bit better for others. And I think that's something that's sometimes not stressed enough when we make this transition. Integrating biodiversity, we have to protect nature, but also we love nature. And if you think about it, we are nature. So it's not really how much can we talk about integration, right? It's just that's who we are too. So I think that's a different mindset that ultimately underlies all of this. This is just this thing on the lower right I live in the US now, and I also think it's very interesting because the US is the richest country in the history of the world, and our GDP per capita is still increasing. But it's very clear that we're not happier. And that is actually borne out better if you look at something else, like the genuine progress indicator, which was proposed by Herman Daly, an American economist, who said, okay, we can take GDP, that's important too, but then we subtract pollution, natural destruction, loss of social cohesion and community. And then you see that actually the US has peaked in the 70s in terms of well-being. What we see, what I think now is interesting, at the time Herman Daly was quite alone, and things are changing. It's right now, especially in the academic world, article after article about some form of well-being economics is coming out. Nature, obviously, everybody is aware of, but like all the academic journals have that. There was the Beyond Growth conference in the European Parliament last year. It was completely packed. Nobel Prize winners are weighing in. The President of Ireland, other state politicians have said we need to govern more by a measure of well-being. This recent Google Ngram, which scans a very large part of the literature, you can see now that green growth, where we hang on to growth, right? Because we can do that because we can decouple, and it's just not happening. So green growth for a long time was really en vogue 10 years ago, and it's starting to come down. And people stop mentioning it because it's just not working. And what you do see is that planetary boundaries, degrowth, these notions are becoming more and more popular in the media. So degrowth has now surpassed the mention of green growth. But what I find even more interesting, working as somebody working in corporate America, it's also hitting the business and mainstream media. It's not mainstream yet, but it is coming out of the fringes where the mainstream media is seriously covering it. So not as a joke. So we have Harvard Business Review, Financial Times, Bloomberg, Foreign Affairs, World Economic Forum, the New York Times, Forbes. They're all talking about it. I gave a TED Talk 2 months ago at the Bloomberg Green Festival in Seattle. It's and big politicians were there too. It's really, people are starting to take this seriously. What would a post-economic growth world look like? I think, and that is very, very telling. And I think that's something where people are really starting to open up to the fact that, oh yeah, this is business as usual is no longer working. And what is a new, better economic system that can help us get there? And then I mentioned this earlier, the mindset shift. Okay, so we have the imperative, we know what we can do. It's still not certain that we will, and that's fair, because we don't know what's going to happen. I get that question a lot. Do you think this will happen? I truly don't know. We can, in terms of like the plans, policies, in terms of technologies, and also because of our human capabilities. Human history is full of examples of people who wholesale abandoned their previous social organization and adopted a radically new model based on new underlying values, because that's what this ultimately comes towards. But history is also full of examples of collapse. So the truth is, I don't know, and nobody really knows. I do know that we can, and I also see that most want it. You see this also in surveys. Especially in Europe, the majority of people, they favor these post-growth kind of values, where you of sufficiency, equality, those kind of things. But also outside of Europe, people in advanced economies, they are aware that we need deep systemic changes, and a majority of people support an economy that prioritizes health and well-being of people over nature, of well-being of people and nature over profit. So, I'm sorry, I need to get a glass of water. Now we're coming to the most interesting part, I think, which is, what does this then mean for you? what does this mean for transportation? What does letting go of growth look like there? And I think that's a very interesting thing, and I'm looking forward to that discussion as well. I think ultimately what it really comes down to is unequivocally less demand. There's no way around that. But of course, when you talk about well-being, mobility is a huge part of well-being. So how do we bridge that? And there is a lot of interesting research on that in degrowth, for example. And I also think it depends on where you are. If you are, like I am, in a rich country, that really goes to new ways of living. We don't need more roads. This is very clear, but it's more than that, right? Of course, it's also about redistricting better, where you don't need to have this commute so far and all those things. But it is also about changing the mindset of this romantic notion of living a full life because you went to all these exotic places. I see this a lot in more advanced economies. There's also the other side, where if you are in the still developing country, then you have to go. Increasing mobility is still very important for well-being. But then how do you do that without also increasing demand? And there's so much more possibilities now with these technological advancements, which also need to be shared sometimes between countries. So there's a whole geopolitical aspect to that as well. But I'm also looking forward to discussing that more in, excuse me, with you, because you are, in this sense, more experts than I am. I'm so sorry. So my question would be, what other changes do you see, like in this mindset shift, this cultural shift that could encompass? And also, if you have questions for me, I would love to hear that as well.
Thank you very much, Gaya. This was, as I anticipated, very inspiring and important for us to learn. I think it's something that we really have to embrace. We have time for discussion now, and I think this is a very important moment that we all engage in this discussion. But since I'm standing here, I can start with asking some questions to you. So I'll take the liberty to do that. Let me begin with this. You mentioned that we have to get away from growth, and this is what you can read in the degrowth economies and things like that. Growth is identified as an important problem. But when I try to explain this to others, and I'm a non-economist, I hear them saying that growth is necessary. We need growth to establish new businesses. If you start a new business, you need to grow to compete with others. If you don't grow, if you don't accumulate capital, then you will disappear, because the competition is huge. You will be outcompeted entirely. But since I'm an ecologist, I think that, well, it's natural, it's obvious. Everybody needs to grow until a certain limit. And we're living in a finite world, and in a finite world, growth is not cannot continue relentless. There is a limit to growth, naturally, and everything that grows must decay. That's the cycle of life. But so when we grow and become more and richer, and we need to decay as well. We need to die. We need to disappear. And when we talk about that, we realize that no, this is not what we want to do. We don't want to die. We don't want to decay and disappear. We want to live in a sustainable way. But this is not natural, isn't it? There's nothing sustainable in nature. It's always a growing and a growth and decay, a taking and giving. It's always back and forth. There's no balance, there's no sustainability. It always appears to be sustainable because it is controlled and affected by external factors. We want to eradicate these external factors and take fate in our own hands, right? So we need to develop a completely unnatural way of dealing with our own life. And this is the big challenge. So how do we live in a sustainable way? It has never been tested. Or has it?
Yes, I would disagree with that. If you look at nature, if you want to do that and say, well, we don't see this in nature, I think it's almost the exact opposite. You see growth, and then you see typically it approaches a certain point and then it stabilizes. So this is what I would call a dynamic equilibrium. So you are right that it's not. There's always it's always changing. So what you mentioned, I think, is this constant different forces. That's correct, but that can be a very dynamic, but nonetheless equilibrium. And that's what you typically see in things that are sustainable. There's some kind of natural equilibrium that things oscillate around instead of this ever upward trend. The only thing that you see that really explodes is cancer. And that is naturally occurring in that sense, but it kills. And that's what a quest for ever growth is. I would also say that it is this letting go of growth is not anti-growth. This is a often heard misconception. It doesn't mean that we can never have growth. If you are a startup and you're doing great stuff and you're growing, that's great. But it's this growth at all costs that is really detrimental. Mm-hmm. And I would also say that in the EU, there was a survey of companies, most companies, 90%. So the vast majority, they have some stable equilibrium and they're quite happy there. They don't need to grow forever.
So we have to find limits to growth above a certain level. Is this what you were saying?
Yeah, I think the ultimate measure would just be different. So we would have well-being. So if growth contributes to well-being, as we define it, and of course, but how we see that in every context is a political discussion. That's why governance, for example, is a key part of sustainability as well. Most people want changes and want to combat climate change. It's not happening enough. So that also goes a little bit back to what I mentioned in the full circle economics, where power and money also has to flow better throughout society to get a more democratic decision making. But that's what I would say. It's like you're not anti-growth, but it's not the ultimate goal anymore.
Hmm. Let me ask another question then. When you say that we need to set limits, we need a stronger governance, a stronger control of growth, and get away from growth itself as the main target. Doesn't that sound a bit like we need more control over the market? We need a controlling government, stronger governments and control of the economic market, and that sounds a bit like anti-capitalism. And well, you can even go further, talk about communism and socialism. But I think that well-being economy is nothing like that. It's something new. Or how would you describe that?
I agree. It would be something new. It is important to note that while it's true, I don't see this happening under capitalism. A lot of communist regimes and socialist regimes are also very growth-driven. So that's not unique to capitalism. So I think that it would be something new that probably had some elements of all of it. For example, I do think that too much of life, really, life-giving and living things has been commoditized under capitalism. And so the decommodification that is necessary of basically everything, our obviously above nature, but also our inner world, right? Our attention, our social interactions are being commoditized by new tech. And I think that's the sort of thing that would have to be reversed. And I can see in that aspect that the community organizing and community stewarding of their local commons would come back, and in that sense would have aspects of communism, but nothing obviously like the Soviet style regime that we saw.
Yeah, certainly not. This is nothing that we don't want to go back in history. We want to go forward.
No, I don't blame you.
No.
Yeah.
No, of course not. Then I also think if we try to translate this to the transport sector, what does it mean? How can we let loose of growth in the transport sector? You mentioned that already in your slide before. It's the growing demand for more transport, for more mobility, for more infrastructure that we see. That we all know that we're planning to expand our existing infrastructure, to double our existing infrastructure around the world, with devastating effects on our environment, of course. So how do we reduce the demand for transportation without maybe infringing on this well-being part, the mobility itself?
Yeah, and I think in that aspect, you go back to what you see a lot when we talk about implementation in general of this in different countries. You see very different pathways, and I think that's important to mention as well. Typically, in general, what you would see is that in countries like the US, the focus would be on deliberately shrinking the ecological footprint back to sustainable levels, because we're just above our share of earth-sharing capacity. And the part of that is also, there's obviously the natural aspect, but there's also the social aspect, because it is true that in a lot of other regions in the world, their growth will more often correlate with well-being. And so we have a responsibility in these, especially in the post-colonial European countries and the US, to make ecological space for them to still grow if it benefits them. And so that and that we can do that because here what has decoupled, there's no carbon decoupling, but what has decoupled in the West is well-being and happiness from growth. That has been stable at best. In the US, it has been going down. So we can do that. And I think that's a similar thing that you see for transportation. What we really want is not more cars or more roads. We want mobility, right? And it's very hard to give a concrete answer to that because it depends so much per region, per country, per state, and even per village, really. But I think that is what the solutions you would have to be coming from this well-being paradigm, where we're like, if we need more roads, maybe sometimes that's possible, but let's see if what people really need before we just start planting more roads there.
And I think the critical question is, how do we reduce the need for transportation? That means we transport goods, we transport people, and thankfully during the COVID epidemic, we have seen that we can live without so much transportation. We don't need to travel to work every day, for example. There are small things that we have realized that have already changed. And when you think about freight and the global economy, the global trade, you realize that this is only possible because transportation is so cheap. It doesn't cost you very much to have your production in China, for example, and ship your plastic forks from China to, I don't know, the US, where you can get them. The design comes from the US maybe for these plastic knives and forks, but they are produced in China and have to be transported back. And this is with all other material that we're using. We have outsourced manufacturing. So how would it be? What would happen if we if we internalize the external costs of transportation? If we really let transportation pay its true cost.
Yeah, exactly. And if the true cost would be in there, we wouldn't be even making plastic forks, probably, let alone shipping them. But again, I think here it's also important to realize, because I feel like this happens often sometimes when people are like, yeah, how we're going to do that. Let's start from the basis. And again, I'm going to give the overall one and then bring it back to transportation. Often when I hear this, yes, okay, well, changing a whole economic system, that's a lot of effort. I'm like, yeah, but dealing with the aftermath of ecosystem collapse is also a lot of effort. It's not, the implicit assumption there is that business as usual is a possibility. And it's not. It's absolutely impossible to keep this up. So the question is not whether we can keep growing or not. The question is whether the end of growth comes by design or disaster.
Yeah.
And I do think that's the same here when we talk about mobility. It's like, yeah, okay, but there are 1,001 reasons that we do need more roads there. Maybe the thing is, you're not really bringing mobility. We all know this. People here in the audience know this better than I do, probably. That in a lot of poorer countries, the traffic jams are already insane. It doesn't matter. We all know that you spend the same amount of time spend the same amount of traffic in an EV or a gasoline car. So it's not that we're going to deliver them the mobility by doing what we've done in the past anyway. And I think that's a better starting point to have that discussion sometimes.
Exactly. But then, if I may continue and ask one more question, it's when we internalize the external costs in transportation, we all have to pay, and everything will become more expensive. We will probably produce an inflation that makes it almost impossible to live prosperly, or to endure life as we know it. Yep. At least in the Western world.
No, that's a good point. And this is a very understandable fear. The fear of, but I need to pay my rent kind of thing. When I say letting go of growth, people say, wait, are you telling me I have to do with even less? Because I'm pretty stressed to meet my needs as it is, actually. Yeah. And I completely understand that. This is exactly why we need a new economic system, because we have created a system where cost of living is, think about that, cost of living. It's a dystopian term, and we all just throw it around like it's a normal term. But that is the key, of course, with what we've done in this economic system. That's what I mean with, we've capitalized our lives where the things that we need to literally stay alive, we have to pay for it. And we have nothing left to sell but our labor in most cases. So of course, when we hear letting go of growth, we're like, am I going to lose my job? Because I need that income. So that's why in a post-growth, in a well-being economy, all those needs, not all the wants, but needs are universal. Science is very clear about that. Social science has identified our needs. They're universal, so we can design policies for them, and they are finite. We don't need an endless amount of stuff to satisfy them. So when we design policies, livelihoods would be secure, no matter what. Even if you don't have a job, your livelihood will be secure. You will not have a whole lavish lifestyle, but nobody would have to struggle to make ends meet. And I think that would be the starting point. But you're right that we would have less stuff. I think this goes for everybody in the West. We would have less stuff. But most of that stuff doesn't really make us happier after a certain amount anymore. And so while you would have to let go of, certainly very rich people would have to let go of some things they've gotten used to, like private jets, I don't think we could have that. So there would certainly be things that are not around anymore, mega yachts. I don't think they wouldn't make economic sense anymore. But we would have a lot more of what we really need, because we don't just have material needs, we have social needs, and we have spiritual needs for a life of meaning, including a sense of calm the peace of mind that this prosperity can last. Yeah. It's very hard to enjoy even the best luxury today if you think it's going to be taken away tomorrow or from your children. So that's what I always say. It's like, yes, you would have less stuff, but you would have more of what you really need. And I think we can do that for mobility as well. Certain things like trips around the world, like certain people that just do check in the boxes. It's a very consumerist kind of travel. The way some people tourist is very like, yeah, I've been there, check it out. And they didn't talk to one local person. I think that kind of travel probably might also not fit anymore, but you would have different things where you can get around and get all your needs met in your community, and you really know what's in your community. And I think that could easily be a sense of fulfillment as well.
I think that sounds rather good. So there's there's a light in the dark that we see if we start to think about that. But let me ask you here in this audience, the participants of this conference, what do you think? How can we contribute to that? Where are our tools? Where is our power? Any ideas on that? Any particular ideas? Or do you have questions to Gaya? So please don't hesitate to speak up. Vincent, over there.
It may not be a question, but thanks, Gaya, for that very intriguing presentation. You mentioned cultural shift, and I hear this being bandied around quite a bit from the perspective that we all need to change. What was your thinking there from a cultural perspective, and how would you see shifts in social norms contribute to that cultural shift?
Yes, thank you. I think it really, it starts by the cultural shift, and what I mean with that is really the stories we tell about ourselves, even all the way down to who we are. And then, of course, also why we are together in this society and why we are on this earth. So this, in that sense, the systems change it's a very big economic system, but to start it, the change, you have to start at the personal level, and it's deeply personal. We all have been told things, for example, that we're never satisfied, maximalist consumers, and we should see, if we're rational, we should see the impacts on others as externalities, and this doesn't describe us very well. And it's also I think it's hard to identify with, and it doesn't always. For a lot of people, it doesn't resonate with who they actually feel on some level they are, that they derive actually a great sense of joy of contributing to other well-being. And I think that's one of the many ways also that I explain it to people in richer countries, what they have to gain. Again, what I just mentioned, the social and the spiritual needs. Most people, surveys show, the majority of people in Europe and the US are disconnected at work. They're disengaged because they feel that their job is just tricks for money, and what they do doesn't really have value. And there's a mental suffering in that. I'm not saying they're bigger victims than starving children in Africa, because they categorically are not. But ultimately, nobody gets treated with full respect, I would say, in this economic system. So when you're talking about the cultural shift, it would really be much more life-centered, where what is alive has strict priority over what is not alive today, which is not the case. We see this in laws. In the US, companies now have certain rights as human beings, which makes no sense if the company is not alive. And I think this strict division, I think it's very telling that that's in the law. We don't distinguish anymore between what can suffer and what cannot suffer. And I think that's in a well-being economy, our societal priorities would really be centered around life, that what is living and what is life-giving, like water and those kind of stuff, clean air, healthy soil, although healthy soil is actually very much alive. But I think that's the kind of societal changes and what I mean with a cultural shift.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Yeah, that's really worth thinking about. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Gaya. More questions? Yes, Manuela?
Thank you for a fantastic talk. And I think probably to be a bit optimistic, I think the best thing we can do is to be like you and try to, with your behavior and your studies and your work, to try to influence other people around us and change first and foremost ourselves. But my question is actually a bit pessimistic. I find myself in a difficult position because I was really crying when I was speaking, actually. So the thing is, the time frame is quite short for change, right? And I would like to understand what does that, how does the model work there? Because I don't believe, I really wish we managed to do this in time, but I don't believe it at all. So we could change inside ourselves in that frame of time, but we don't change the whole world and the whole economic system in that frame of time, in my opinion. I'm being very pessimistic now, but that's what I believe. So the question is, first of all, if you have a tip on what's the chance that we make it in time, but the other question is, how does the model work after the tipping point? Because I'm an ecologist, and usually in ecology, you don't have just crash and that's it. You have crash and dynamic equilibria that are not stable, but are ups and downs, like circles. And so the question is, how good is the model in understanding what happened after the 5 years from now, after the 10 years from now? After we start declining, what happened? Are we just doomed, or is there possibility, and how more difficult would it be to come back up again?
Those are very understandable feelings. So let me start with the last question and then go a little bit back. So the model is not that informative for after the collapse because it's built for before the collapse. So the authors were very careful to warn that once the collapse is set in, what comes, where the lines end up around the end of the chart at the end of the 21st century, is that doesn't tell you anything. So because then all the interactions will probably become very different, right? So the model itself doesn't tell us much there. Other models by now from researchers, earth scientists, etc., they say a lot more about these things. But the truth is, nobody knows for sure. It is completely unknown because this has never happened before. We've all been alive in the Anthropocene, in the Heliocene, and that we will go now to the Anthropocene. We have entered the Anthropocene, where the biggest impact on the world is what humans do, is human activity. And that is completely unprecedented. This kind of breakdown in the climate system is unprecedented. We've had previous big changes in the weather, and we've had mass extinctions, but the truth is it's different every time. So we really don't know. The best guesses are that humans will survive. Death rates will probably go up, and a lot of other species will get lost. Ultimately, things will recover. It's just that it's a lot of suffering that was unnecessary, and I think that's one of the key things to remember. It's not even necessary because we really would have done this for just an illusion of a doomed growth pursuit, and I think that's a lot of people are feeling down about that. I think you see this in surveys, especially young people are not optimistic about the future. You are right that it's a lot of work to be done, and really, I mean, we're running so fast out of time, and it is absolutely not guaranteed that will happen at all. There is a chance that we just won't do it. I will say though that we have seen this before in history, where people all of a sudden there's a tipping point. So we hear these tipping points for the climate system, right? We see tipping points in the system, and what that means is that once you're past that tipping point, and we're very close to that, that's what people like Johan Rockström are warning about, that once you pass that tipping point, there's no stopping the change. So that's also what the Paris Agreement was about. If we don't stop before the 1.5 warming, things will become self-reinforcing in the Earth system. And even if we completely stop putting out carbon at that time, it will still continue to go. That's what a tipping point is, because it's permanently out of balance. And that's what you also have in a society. You can have social tipping points. And I think that's sometimes important to remember it's not necessary to change the minds of the majority. What happens is that people start to become aware and build out this new narrative that I just mentioned. This other narrative where basically we're not these selfish maximizing consumers. Ultimately, we are nature, and that's what we want to see in the world. When people start building out that new narrative in their part in the system, so everybody here, each and everyone in this room can make that change and build out that new narrative in their job. And then they do this just jointly at first, but over time start to form connections with people. And that's when you see the change happening. And that typically happens around 20% of the population. And then the change becomes self-reinforcing. And only then does the majority come along. So I think it's important to remember and keep that in mind sometimes when you feel alone in this. There are other people working in the system, and they are growing in numbers.
That's a very good point, because we realize that when we think about this, we see that there's so much already going on. There are many organizations around Europe and the world that are dealing with these questions. So we want to team up with them. We want to join them in the endeavor to implement a different way of life, translate this into the transport sector, of course. Eric, you had a question?
Regina from Cerema, France. Thank you for your beautiful presentation. It's very inspiring. But I want to say that the devil hides behind details. And for example, you could have some acceleration in policy. For example, people are moving a lot and are more and more angry and vote for extremes. And that could destabilize our societies in Europe and in the States. The fact is that so many things are influenced by behavior, human behavior. And for example, all the economic crash we had in previous year in financial economy were linked to unpredictable behavior of the people working in that trade economy. So the idea is to say, how could we stabilize it and try to educate in a good way key persons like politicians, like yes, politicians are the main decision makers, but also economists, and explaining that territory could manage social, their area, their planning, strategic planning, all these things that could stabilize the system. So how could we do, for example, showing the evolution of a cost, growing higher each year if we don't do anything, or things like that. I'm asking you a question: do you have any solution in education and to stabilize people and educate them to think that future is not so bad and avoiding extremes? And there is another one last point what I would like to say. It's about fake news and fake science. There is a huge pressure in our industry, in the world, in societies who are, especially in certain production of energy or others, other productions. How could we do facing against this fake news, fake science? Thank you.
Yeah, you bring up many good points. I think you bring up polarization. I think that's the first to address. It's very well understood in general, despite what you say that people are highly misinformed or at least uneducated about these issues. But what is generally just intuitively well understood is that the current growth-based system is environmentally destructive. What is much less understood, but equally true, is that it also very much socially degenerative. It also hollows out social cohesion, in a large part because it always increases income and wealth inequality. So the UN Human Rights Council, it's a few months only back, so this year, came out with that was the first time where they talked about the poverty of growth, and they said actually this growth pursuit was touted as the solution to poverty, and it's done the opposite. And in that sense, it's a human rights violation because it gives more and more to people who already have their needs met at the expense of very poor people. And that's the global view, of course, but you see this happening within countries as well. And then you get that fuels polarization because people are unhappy, and then you open up the door to populism. People who say, "I'm going to have a quick fix for you." They never do that, but it is a predictable outcome of a society or an economic system that treats just an ever larger group of people who are struggling to have their needs met. You're going to get angry people with that. So that's another reason why it's so unsustainable what we're doing. In fact, now in the Club of Rome, one of the previous writers of that book, The Limits to Growth, Jorgen Randers, he says, at the time I thought the first collapse would come from the environmental destruction. And he says, I'm now convinced the social unrest will come first before the ecosystem collapse. There's just too many people who have too little left to lose. And you certainly see that around the world, and you definitely see that in the US right now. It's a very interesting time. We just had an assassination attempt at one of our presidential candidates. As you know, we have more people than guns in this country, so it's going to be interesting. Whoever wins, it's going to be interesting to see how that's going to be received. There are interesting times, to put it euphemistically. The other thing you mentioned in particular was education, and I agree. So I do my best. I give a lot of guest lectures on this. Some universities have integrated it more. What's interesting to see is that also how these big money interests, so the fossil fuel sector, for example, has also completely bought certain universities. But for example, at the time, MIT, these were MIT scientists. And then at a certain point, the Koch brothers, who made billions with fossil fuels, just gave hundreds of millions of dollars to MIT for funding. And ever since that, it's been cranking out only papers about carbon sequestration and clean coal. And it's just very interesting to see how this kind of misinformation is indeed and again, this goes back again to the full circle economics that I mentioned. If you don't also have power and money circulating through the economy instead of accumulating at the top, you will never get to that material circularity. You will never get to sustainability because of all these social and behavioral aspects that you mentioned. So, I mean, we're not going to tackle the whole education system right now, but I will conclude by saying I completely agree. It should be, I think most of us who went to college had a mandatory economics 101 class, right? And I think that's what we should have at colleges, a mandatory sustainability 101.
That's a very good idea, a very good proposal. Everybody should learn the basics of ecology. That's good. There was a question in the chat. Could you please show it to us? Let me see. So the question by Henrik Wildenschild, Gaya is one of the biggest problems that politicians in many countries are dependent by funding from growth sectors. Should all politicians be paid by the state instead?
Yeah, so that goes to what I alluded to earlier, the governance aspect of sustainability, which is pivotal. I'm not sure I agree with the last statement. Just because I'm not necessarily an expert on governance, it's true that certain things should be done by the state, but I think it's very important to remember, and this might also go back a little bit to our previous capitalism versus Marxism kind of thing. It's not that we only have a choice between let's business solve it or let the state solve it. In fact, what you saw was that this state coming in was after the Marxist manifesto, and certain capitalist economies were like, oh, okay, yeah, we don't want this kind of reforms. And so they went to the state. They said, how about you soften these harder aspects of capitalism? Where I was born, the Netherlands, is an excellent example of that. It's a very capitalist country, but it's also very state welfare driven. So you don't fall as far as you do in the US, for example. But it's also not that ideal. There are many things that I was there that I was like, it's just still a lot of people not finding purpose in what they do, and then actually just living off the welfare state, like Americans hate so much, because they don't find a purpose in their life. And I think it's important to see that once you dive into things more, you see, wait, there's this thing that we've kind of forgotten over the years, which is the power of community. And that's what you see when you use things like citizen assemblies. You get policies that are broadly shared and supported by the population, which are typically more radical and better, really, in terms of effectiveness than what companies or states can do. An excellent example is France. They had citizen assemblies to decide what should we do about climate change. And things that came out of there was just things like banning short-term flights. Like, you can't do it anymore. It's just banned. They were like, you can take a train. And I don't think state politicians could have gotten there. But that's what happens when you have deeper democracy. So one of the aspects about this is also that we give the self-reliance back to communities and also decision-making back to the people. We need, in that sense, more democracy will also help us to be more sustainable.
Good. When I think about governance, in this respect, I think that governance can help us to loosen some of the barriers, the regulation that prevent us from, for example, sharing vehicles or sharing transports, so that we can reduce the need for that everybody's taking their own cars to work or something like that. There are small parts that we can already change with the right governance, if you say so. There was one more question. Yes, please.
Thank you. I'm Liam Innes. I work for the Renewables Grid Initiative based in Berlin. First of all, thank you very much. That was very inspiring. I'll start with the answer to the question, which also links to my question as well. What can we do to contribute to saving the world, if you will, is, I guess, a very personal question as well. I think we all have different skills and different talents, and therefore we need to all kind of look deep and see what is manageable for us. I think one of the most disturbing things under consumerism and capitalism is that people tend to be kind of passengers in society or consumers in a mall and be carried. And then the opposite of that is people who recognize this and then see themselves as needing to be a savior of the world, which is extremely overwhelming and lead to burnout. So I think we all need to see ourselves as agents of change, but within the realms of our own capacities. And my question is, what do you see as the role of activism in this whole change still? Because I did my master's about 6 years ago, and that was like 2017, 2018, when we were seeing this real wave with Fridays for Future, Extinction Rebellion, and it was a really optimistic time for societal change and activism and these tipping points in society. I really kind of expected that we would reach this threshold where society just changes, but now it almost seems like this change is being captured by the mainstream, and I wonder if this is a kind of inevitable thing that activism then becomes mainstream and becomes then greenwashed, or do you see that there is still a major role for radical activism, and how can we as everyday people, professionals, academics, but also dancers, gardeners, whatever it is, get involved?
Yeah, that's a very good question. Yeah, there's a little bit of again, about system dynamics going on there. Do you see this more often where, you should, I would start by saying, don't fall for this straight line in your head, right? Like, oh, we had these activists, and then, okay, so we were gonna see systemic change from there on. And that is typically, progress is not a straight line. I also think that we will never know, but I know that George Monbiot also said that. He said, I think that he believes that if COVID hadn't interfered, because that's what happened at a certain point. You had the Fridays for the Future, and then COVID hit. And so assemblies, at that point, gatherings were forbidden, and that really interrupted the movement. And he believes that that actually stopped right before it could grow to that 20% tipping point that I talked about before. But it's still there. The people are still there. So, and that is how it goes with systems. You have, the system is always ultimately, until it's knocked out of equilibrium and it went over that tipping point, it is primed to restoring its previous equilibrium. So it's resistant to change. So you're going to have to try a couple of times. You shouldn't give up too soon if it doesn't go at first, because it is still building there, but it's been in the buffer. And you have a lot of social buffers in the system as well. So it's important to not give up too soon. That's always what I have. Of course, I'm not certain that this will happen. I think it would be incredibly naive to say that. I also think it's too soon to give up. And I do think that privileged people like me and that are gathered in this room therefore have a responsibility to be the last to give up and not the first ones. So that's what keeps me going. When you say, well, what can we do very concretely? I can answer it. It will be a bit unsatisfactory because it's not a one-fits-all solution. The good news is you are part of the system. So as long as you're part of that system, you have influence. You don't have the illusion of control typically, but that's all. Control is an illusion anyway. But you do have influence. So everybody can start. You would have to find your unique contribution in this system. And it depends on where you are. You can do it at any level. But it starts with changing that narrative from within, from the narrative of, we are selfish. We're doomed to exploit our commons until nothing is left for others, let alone future generations. To, oh, no, we are nature and we rejoice. Once our basic needs are met, we rejoice in contributing to this web of life that we're all part of. And then you start building out that new narrative in your part in the system. You always have influence, and ultimately you're never alone, even though sometimes it might feel like that. So that's what I would emphasize that everybody try to do.
That were wonderful concluding words. Fantastic. The time is already up, unfortunately. I think we could discuss it for hours to come. And I think we need to remind ourselves that, as you said, we can accomplish a change in our own small domains. So let us think about what we can change in our field of transport and ecology. There may be small steps, but if we do this together, many small steps will lead us forward. And I invite you very much to have a look at the IENE conference declaration. This is our first attempt to identify possible paths, possible actions and tasks that we can engage in to bring us forward. We have ideas for arranging seminars, raising this question to a broader public, engage with the energy sector and other sectors. So I think it's time that we connect with other ongoing movements already. And I very much hope to see you again, Gaya, maybe in some of the following seminars. Thank you very much for your inspiring and educating words. And I think we will all carry this with us now during the conference and back home again. And thank you very much for your presentation, and thank you all in the audience for listening. And I wish you
Absolutely.
a happy conference.
Pleasure to be here. Thank you, everybody.
Good. Thank you. You are allowed to stand up now.
No, not yet.
Oh, sorry.
Just a few last words. Thank you, Andres. At some points, I wasn't sure if the keynote speak was from Gaya or from you, but thank you. No, just kidding. It was very, very interesting conversation and discussion. Let's hope our Deputy Minister and Radek Kropelnicki from Motor and Railway Directorate of the Czech Republic, I already learned it, have taken some notes. And now just want to remind you that for tomorrow's schedule, we'll be here at 9 a.m. For 2 plenary sessions, and then we'll move for the parallels to the faculty building. And that's it. We have now a little small refreshment here. Enjoy the conference, enjoy and have a good week. Thank you very much.